Unforgiven were the definitive no-hit wonder, the most unknown band to ever be iconic. Most would not recognize them today. For those who lived through the 80s though, maybe their image stirs some vague, distant memory. A spaghetti western-style arena rock group that crossed elements of punk music and metal with an 80s pop glamour. A sharp image which resulted in one of the largest record label bidding wars ever in 1985. That record basically still stands to this day. Their reign on the top of the music world would be brief though. The group's only album barely cracked the charts upon release, and they fell off afterwards. By 1988, all that was left of them was a four-man group playing clubs of a couple dozen around California. Still, the cassette tapes and music continued. It was all the product of one man, John Henry Jones, the voice behind the 1986 self-titled album, better known as Steve Jones. Punk musician turned outlaw country rocker, later turned Renaissance fair jouster, then turned TV producer. The band's concept and pitch was all his own. It was also his own failure. Jones grew up in the southern region of California, known as the Inland Empire, from where the Unforgiven were assembled. Inland Empire itself was an odd cultural hotbed of the 80s, where punk and country mixed on the fringe of the American Southwest. The major result of this was the Unforgiven. West Coast punk rockers turned spaghetti western outlaws. The group was all about hard-hitting sound, lyrical literacy, and masculine ethos mixed with 80s magazine covers. Their stylistic influence was underappreciated, but that is because nobody knew what to call the Unforgiven sound when it existed. Their longest legacy was in Inland Empire, where trench coats were called Unforgiven coats for years after the band was disbanded. Their career was brief, but their image was felt. That is until, well, saddle up for one last ride with the Unforgiven, and you really gotta hear these guys. The essence of the Unforgiven came from Riverside and San Bernardino, California, a region known as the Inland Empire. Inland Empire is far less California than most would think for being in California. Culturally, it has more in common with Arizona or even New Mexico. Far more rural, and especially in the 80s, more conservative than the rest of the state. Historically, the area has been settled by everyone from Mexican ranchers to American cattlemen to Dust Bowl refugees, and even immigrants from the South during the Depression. This has given the Inland Empire very unique cultural history for the area. The Unforgiven drew upon it to unite them with the popularity of punk. Steve Jones liked to claim, though maybe it was more marketing, that his grandfather, John Henry, was John Steinbeck's traveling companion while he wrote The Grapes of Wrath, though as said, that might have just been a fictional boast. Growing up in the shadow of both Hollywood and on the edge of the historical Wild West, it is no wonder the Unforgiven developed such bombast. There was nothing tongue-in-cheek about the Unforgiven, they were as sincere as a six-shooter. Steve Jones' father, being a small-time actor, and his own self-professed love for spaghetti westerns, just added to the aesthetic. The concept for a group of headbanging western renegades started when Jones and fellow Unforgiven member Mike Finn were brainstorming the idea in a film class in college. The name The Unforgiven had come from an encyclopedia of western movies. The Unforgiven's use of the title The Unforgiven predated the Clint Eastwood movie by about 7 years. Jones' original name for the group, though, was The Choir Boys, but that had been rejected as an Australian rock band was already using it. Names like The Wild Bunch and Once Upon a Time in the West, stylized OUT West, or Out West, were considered, but the band agreed upon The Unforgiven due to the original 1960s film's social message. While the mastermind behind the band, Jones had come up as a musician in the original 1977 LA punk rock movement while he was just a teenager. Truly its own topic, but Jones was at the helm of bands such as the Stepmothers and The Urge, where he often took the vocals for the bands. Elements of heavy metal already seeping into his style. A common collaborator then was the Simple Tones guitarist Jay Lansford, who would surface in other incarnations of The Unforgiven as well in the future. Either way, Jones' early years would do much to influence the Western rebellion present in the Unforgiven sound once the Stepmothers dissolved in 1983. Lansford had left the band by 80-81 anyways. By 1984-85, Steve Jones got a trench coat and reinvented himself as John Henry Jones in honor of his grandfather. because there was already another popular Steve Jones already on the books in punk. Jones already had the concept for the Unforgiven by '83, he just needed the players. While reported the members of the Unforgiven were renegades who had never known each other before the band, this was largely pulp fiction. Steve Jones knew bassist Mike Finn from college, and those two knew guitarist Mike Just Jones from working as lifeguards in Corona, California. That was already half of the original lineup by 1986. Johnny Hickman was already a well-established guitarist, and continues to be to this day. Todd Ross ended up as the band's fourth guitarist and firebrand. A history enthusiast, Alan Waddington signed on as the band's drummer, and told it was Jones who put us all together. The first lineup shook out as John Henry Jones on vocals/guitar, Johnny Hickman on second vocals/guitar, Todd Ross on guitar, Just Jones on guitar, Mike Finn on bass, and Alan Waddington on drums. The group was an Inland Empire project to its core, with members hailing from Upland, Pomona, Corona, Redlands, and Claremont. The six reflected the area's complicated history, paying homage to every ancestor. Steve Jones, Mike Finn, and Mike Jones all had native ancestry, with Jones's ancestors coming from Oklahoma. Waddington himself was descended from the Spanish governor of California, José Dario Aguero, despite his incredibly Anglo last name. And yes, the band did in fact have 4 guitarists. The Unforgiven were kind of like if you took Blue Oyster Cult and inverted the colors, similar idea of a concept band constructed to one man's vision. Both bands would suffer a similar amount of concept drift from their original idea, for better or worse though. Jones has admitted he was both the driving force and slave driver behind them. Honestly, I've always been the ringleader, and I don't think any of my former bandmates would dispute that. Some of them, however, might prefer a more colorful term for me. What the Unforgiven exactly were was never clear, or never got far enough in development to be clear. This resulted in the band's genre being pigeonholed as garage band, despite the fact they barely actually sounded like one. Jones declared they were a sort of Western Americana group focused on masculinity. They could have been any sort of cowboys, marauders, Civil War veterans, Western deserters, and wanderers that their songs talked about. In the end, they were the Rover Pack, as their song said. Even with the confusion of what the Unforgiven was billed as, they had killer style. The 1986 album cover stands as the defining image of the band. Punk cowboys with 80s hair. Of course, the photo is far from historically accurate, and the only one wearing an actual trench coat is Steve Jones in the middle. Todd Ross brings up the left in a monkey suit, jacket, and jeans. Next is Johnny Hickman dressed in an Undertaker's long coat. John Henry Jones, Steve Jones, and Alan Waddington III hang in the middle. Jones in trench coat and bolo tie. Waddington is dressed like he just walked out of the Civil War in stonewashed jeans. Mike Finn is next with his hair so blonde, he could make any 80s blockbuster villain blush. Then there is Mike Just Jones with a gunslinger hat and what looks to be a skin-tight leather biker vest. The costume cacophony gave the band an interesting, anachronistic image, if anything. Is it a mess? Yes, kind of. But these guys had character. According to Jones in the book Cramp, Slash, and Burn, the group's clothes were plundered from American and European flea markets, which may explain the mishmash of styles, a collection of decades-old formal wear, outdated American-German military surplus gear, and pure California blue jeans. This was not marketing either. The group did actually dress like that on stage, until they were drenched in sweat and ripped off their shirts. Strong continuity from Jones' time in the Stepmothers to the Unforgiven. Coming from a punk background, Jones wanted the band to be, or at least be perceived as, straight edge. Every article made sure to note the Unforgiven's anti-alcohol, anti-drugs, and anti-nicotine philosophy, which may have just been a philosophy of the 80s. Their practice was far from perfect as well, but instead, the band tried to lift weights and work out to build their brotherhood and image before concerts, always working out before the shows to get prepared. As Jones said back in the 80s, "We run, lift weights, sweating and grunting together. You know, it's like male bonding. We're family. And then we can take off our shirts on stage to impress girls and not be embarrassed." The philosophy of not be embarrassed actually paid dividends for the Unforgiven on the musical front. With one drummer, one bassist, and 4 guitarists, their music was a bold-faced wall of Western sound. It almost borders on undescribable, but in a good way. The Western and punk elements are there, but it is mixed with a dozen other influences that only add to it. All of it doled out in an almost military march-like style. The best description of the Unforgiven sound declared it a cavalry-like cadence. The sound and lyrics stretch deep into both Americana and literature, a pretty obvious influence when 3 of the members went on to be teachers after the band. Comparisons to the writing of American author Ambrose Bierce are not uncommon, and one of the group's best songs, All Is Quiet on the Western Front, is a near-direct reference to the German novel, later movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. The group's songs switch between glorifying gunslingers/movie cowboys to focusing on Native American identity, the group being sort of masculine, pacifistic cowboys who like to tell stories about both sides. A revisionist western in the form of a band. The Unforgiven were never able to solve the USA's problems, but they embraced the nation's contradictions without apology. Tradition, reality, and legacy in a very odd package. When asked about socially conscious cowboys by the press, John Henry, Steve, Jones, summed up the Unforgiven's mission statement. I wanted to put Aaron Copland's Americana together with fist-raising teenage rock and roll anthems, and for Christ's sake, why waste time trying to categorize music? Just sing along if you know the words. As Steve's project, it was his vision, an assortment of genres he would refer to later as outlaw country combined with southern rock in an arena rock style. No surprise the Unforgiven became 80s critic darlings then. Even before they released a single album, the Unforgiven were being sold on a sort of false popularity. Music magazines such as Spin and other West Coast music gazettes were praising them as the next big thing, off basically nothing. Only a few journeyman performances in clubs scattered across California. Soon, music rags across the country were talking about a band that could appeal to both hippies and rednecks with its own pop power. All of a sudden, corporate executives were hearing about the 6-man outfit in board meetings. The race to sign them was on. This ignited a massive bidding war in 1985, which is still legendary to this day. Studios on both coasts wanted to sign the Unforgiven. A major New York label even cold-called Jones and declared they would sign the Unforgiven unseen and unheard. It would be Elektra, or Elektra/Asylum, that would win them though. Label vice president, Peter Philbin, got the Unforgiven for an undisclosed, but very lucrative deal. Rumors state somewhere in the multi-millions, but the actual amount is not clear, being sold on the band's image alone. Either way, Elektra Asylum fronted a bill which included signing on Motley Crue's manager, Metallica's attorney, and the booking top-line agency, CAA, to promote the Unforgiven. How could a band fail with this behind them? Well, they did, but we'll get to that. To promote the Unforgiven, the force behind the group set up a music video, tours, and a lone album. By 85-86, MTV music videos were still relatively new, but after only 4 years, their purpose was still unclear. Management saw it as good promotion though. Embracing their Sergio Leone roots, the Unforgiven wanted to make a spaghetti western off their pilot song, I Hear the Call. The band even wanted Clint Eastwood to direct it and sent him an advance copy of their album, as a sort of appeal. He never responded though there was that movie. But anyways, the result was the Unforgiven's only music video. It was apparently played an absurd amount at night on MTV. Source on that is my mom. Unlike the album, it was a major success, at least in regards for being a music video. The video opens with a cameo by, who I assume to be, the actual John Henry Jones, Steve Jones' grandfather in a Guerrero type, until we cut to Steve Jones, rocking that 80s glam, in a Jeep Wrangler on the hunt in California. When he reaches town, the rest of the video turns into a Wild West flashback. John Henry Jones, Steve Jones, is looking to join the Civil War with his own gang. Well, that explains what the Unforgiven were a little bit. After that, Jones assembles the crew from town, the townsfolk afraid of these unknown desperados gathering. Then there's this weird interlude where Jones examines a water trough ladle. Aren't you a cowboy? Either way, the 3 stumble upon the last 3 in a bar. After a tense introduction, they share a sensible chuckle. As they leave, just Jones does his best Clint Eastwood impression. It's not too bad. It then cuts to the band jamming, all the guitars put on display. If you look, you can even see Alan Waddington going absolutely crazy on a marching drum in the background. It's a little funny. The band puts their chops on display until they decide to ride out into the night. The townsfolk watch them go as the flute picks up in the background. As the video closes, we get an excellent shot of Steve Jones on horseback, a trained rider, that makes him look like an absolute badass in his trench coat. It fades out into the past, or future, as an embossing filter overlays the last shot. They hear the call, and they will answer it. Unfortunately, there's not much info on the development of the music video out there, or even its production, but it was presumably shot in southern or central California. Around San Bernardino is a possibility. I was able to dig up one comment by a Huey Smith on a blog that stated, "We supplied the horses and taught John and the rest of the band to ride horses to make the video. My dad is one of the cowboys walking up to the fire." Not much, and it could be a lie, but it's something. After their first and only foray into the visual medium, the Unforgiven continued on their early career bump. The group put in a performance between country legends Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson at Farm Aid 2 in 1986. Willie Nelson's annual charity event to support farmers, a major showing for the Unforgiven's publicity, and one that helped boost their country music legitimacy. A plan that worked when the Unforgiven performed Amazing Grace with Willie Nelson, totally unexpected, at the close of the show. Chris Christopherson even put Jones in a friendly headlock, which became one of the defining moments of the young Jones' career. The high Jones got off the joke led to him writing the unreleased Days Like These, which would later be covered and released by Asia. As Jones later told about the excitement, "We didn't even know what songs we were going to do an hour before we went on stage. We all just got together behind the stage and figured out who was going to do what." Farm Aid 2 was just one of the stops on the Unforgiven's grueling 86-87 tour. For publicity, Elektra put the band on a long road with a tight schedule. They were doing 4 dates a week for 49 weeks across the entire country. That's about 196 shows in 49 weeks. They ranged from tiny clubs in California, to the audience of 70,000 at Farm Aid, to opening for other bands up and down the East Coast. The exhaustion began to set in. Even if their schedule did include opening for bands as massive as Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. The band became increasingly wild on the road. The Six were notorious for gang fights and multiple arrests along the way, all of this capping off when the band opened for ZZ Top in Colorado. While the exact details are unclear and often contradictory, some outrage-fueled mishap supposedly ended up with the Unforgiven being banned from Colorado for the rest of their career. They were coming apart at the seams, but they were still the talk of the town. Their larger-than-life image solidified in their album cover, a photo taken by legendary music photographer John Scapardi in 85-86. The photo would remain the most iconic image of the band to this day. Jones recalls the shoot took only about 10 minutes in some abandoned town near Santa Barbara. The group's manager, Mike Minke, used his old Ford Fairlane, or whatever the hell it was, according to Jones, to kick up the dust behind them. Their objective was to approach the camera while looking intimidating. The issue was the dust kept obscuring the shot or causing them to cough, messing it up, meaning it took several very stone-faced attempts to get it perfect. Even then, the shot is not necessarily 100% correct. Todd Ross is squinting due to the sun, and Mike Jones can be seen glancing off in the direction of the off-screen car. It was perfect enough to print for the album cover, though. To record the actual contents of the album, the band was set up with Boston band producer John Boylan, though supposedly Boylan did not contribute much to the actual production. The band was sent, according to Frederick Bedka, to his studio, as he commented on a website years later. The band came with Boylan and set everything up and played mostly live except for solos and Vox overdubs, and they knocked out 9 or 10 tunes in one day. It was recorded on a 3M56 to 16-track tape machine through an Audiotronics board. Analog heaven. I mixed it the next day and handed over the master mixtapes to Boylan. I think they were 1/2 track, 1/4 masters as I recall. Somewhere, I still have some mixes of these sessions to back up my claim. I saw the band several months later at a music store once. They had finished the album and I got a copy of it, on cassette. Great songs, well thought out, unique concept. But I thought the album was way too processed and slightly overproduced. The drums sounded like a cannon on every song. I must say, there was some beautiful guitar playing going on though. All these guys were excellent players. What about the album then? Well, it's great, but there is a few details to note about it. The original was released in 1986 with 11 songs, the last being Todd Ross's guitar version of Amazing Grace the band performed with Willie Nelson at Farm Aid. The expanded/remastered version released by Real Gone Music in 2014 includes 2 extras. The radio single version of I Hear the Call, and The Long Run Out, which will make sense later. To discuss the original 11 songs, one has to listen to The Unforgiven on their own to really get it though. It will be for you, or it will not. No issue. The album opens with The Unforgiven's magnum opus, All Is Quiet on the Western Front. an anti-war song about a boy discovering a dying soldier, his family saving the soldier, and their relationship with him when he turns out to be a deserter from an undefined war. The soldier teaches the boy about horses and war, but is also haunted by the men he killed, implying he fled due to some form of post-traumatic stress disorder, the conflict/union of masculinity and pacifism being the song's main thread. The broken soldier's only request being, "I want quiet, God, give me quiet," on the Western Front. At the end, the soldier has to leave, much to the family's sadness, when other soldiers come to arrest him for desertion. The song ends on an unclear note with the soldier's escape, but the song's title, "All is Quiet on the Western Front," suggests the war is over and the soldier will find peace in some form. So too will his lessons live on in the boy. It's one of the band's best, and full of blazing guitar solos. The talent is put on display beneath a story told through literary, weaving lyrics. The rest of the album's songs run along similar themes. It is doing them a disservice to run through them quickly, but if I go in depth, we'll be here all day. The next song, Hang 'Em High, opens with a Clint Eastwood impression before delving into a fist-raising Wild West anthem. Waddington's drums hold Steady Jones' voice as he talks about desperado anti-heroes hanging 'em high. Exclamations of "hang 'em high" punctuate the song. I Hear the Call has already been discussed in the context of the band's music video. It's an arena rock anthem about being true to yourself/your beliefs. Rover Pack still stands as the group's unofficial anthem. What's the Rover Pack or Rove Pack? Unforgiven terminology for classic Wild West outlaws who take pride in their less-than-legal victories, usually with a revolver. The song gives gunslingers a sort of fatalism as they willingly accept death. It has a punk sneer, in the good way, with wolf howls and slashing guitars. Cheyenne is a love song. Twisted Sister's Dee Snider named his daughter after it. Good, but not a lot to say about it. The Gauntlet is about a wanderer who is taken for a ride in Daytona and has to escape those he now owes money to, being forced to run the gauntlet as his former friends aim shotguns at him. With My Boots On is probably the band's most introspective song about having to see the strongest man you know on death's door. Though, in the hospital, the man cracks one last smile, saying he wants to die with his boots on. The two share one last joke as the singer takes off his boots to give to him as his final act. The last three songs are the Unforgiven's densest, and those that dig their teeth into the band's concept. Ghost Dance is a rock and roll exploration of Indian identity in 1980s America, being based on Jones' own Cherokee heritage, though how autobiographical the song is unclear. About a man of Cherokee descent who fights in Little Big Vietnam for the United States, pridefully identifying himself as both Native American and American, in what feel to be two pointless battles that contradict one another. The song summed up in the tongue-in-cheek irony of, "I'm a right white man with an Indian legacy, with a love for the land and a hate for the cavalry." The loner is the classic Clint Eastwood wanderer figure transposed on the modern day. Introspection on why people wander, either literally or figuratively. The desire to escape from the past exists in everyone. The eponymous loner stating, "I think I know why some guys gotta drink." The song even takes a few prog rock beats here and there. The Preacher is a straight-up cinematic song about a murderous preacher who comes to town and his relationship with the townsfolk. Saying any more would spoil the song. If you like westerns, give it a listen. It's fast and lyrical in style. The album concludes on Todd Ross's transcendental guitar version of Amazing Grace, just called Grace. It's an absolutely wonderful rendition, but it's Amazing Grace, so there's not much to say. Ross was a damn fine player, and it's a crime he essentially vanished after the 80s. As said, even if none of this seems like your style, really do give The Unforgiven a listen. It's an interesting experience, to say the least. So what happened? The Unforgiven happened to The Unforgiven, unfortunately. Despite critical appeal, The Unforgiven, 1986, only sold 50,000 copies, which is a soft reception to say the least, nearing on outright failure for the build-up The Unforgiven received. At that, profitability evaporated in the eyes of executives and moneymen, which does make sense when so much had been spent on them. A second record, which material had been written for, failed to materialize after Elektra retracted their contract. Tour fatigue and Jones' own abrasiveness set tempers high between the unraveling members. After the Colorado incident, Todd Ross was fired for his exploits, and Johnny Hickman left for his own successful career. The bad blood created between the members would linger for decades. Still, it was Jones' ship, and he would go down with it. The Western emphasis faded as the band disassembled. He diagnosed the Unforgiven as a victim of its own success. When we were starting out, punk rock bands didn't get record deals. The Unforgiven bidding war was one of the biggest in history. Everyone was focused on the deal, and the music and concept got overshadowed by the deal. By 1987, all that was left of the Unforgiven was a remnant, or maybe just squatters. The band had fallen apart. From the original incarnation, only Jones and Waddington remained. Mike Finn apparently vanished at some point, and Mike Jones did hang around for a bit longer, but eventually left too. The Unforgiven did not decline though, but their popularity was gone after the radios dropped their songs. By 87, the Unforgiven had just morphed into a latter-day version of the Stepmothers. Stepmothers originals Jay Lansford and Larry Lee Lerma were brought in to play guitar and bass respectively, though Lansford had been offered a position in the original band back in 85, which he refused. The band shifted from Western with punk to more punk with Western. The new incarnation had largely dropped the gimmick. This is no more obvious than the band's appearance at Farm Aid 2 in 1986 and Farm Aid 3 in 1987. While Jones retained the duster, the band of gunslingers had mostly reverted to a group of guitar-thumping punk rockers. Even the songs reflected this. The two rarities performed at Farm Aid 3 were Brink of Destruction and Days Like These. Brink of Destruction retained vague Western sensibility with metal characteristics, but Days Like These was pure rock and roll. The energy was still there, if not even more energy, but it was rock with punk fundamentals. The band did not outright give up, but after a 2-record deal with Atlantic fell through, the Unforgiven winded down. The day had passed them by. They officially disbanded in 1988. That was that. The show was over. Wait, what about that last song though? The Long Run Out. Well, it's also known as the Ballad of the Unforgiven, and, like all good westerns, it's about the last gunfight before the cowboy rides off into the sunset. The Unforgiven had killed the Unforgiven, but it did not kill music. Over the years, cassette tapes were traded, and parents told children about this crazy cowboy band from the 80s. Fortunately, nobody in the band was a real washout. They all went on to have their own careers. Some perhaps a little bizarre when compared to their past as rock stars. Mike Jones and Michael Finn ended up as high school teachers in California, in the same school no less. And yes, apparently their students do know about their tenure in the band. They also infrequently jam with their former collaborators and their own group, the Hickmen. Alan Waddington followed a similar path. He's now a teacher at Citrus College in Glendora, California, where he's head cross-country coach and instructs at the college's Fine Arts and Performing Center, while also making trips abroad to play in Japan and Korea once in a while. Johnny Hickman continued on his own path with his own independent success. He's currently lead guitarist and vocals for the rock band Cracker, so that's his own story. While hard to find nowadays, Todd Ross is around. Last thing known about him is he was playing bars around California. He's still out there, but largely retired from public life it seems. And while not an original member, Jay Lansford lives in Germany with his wife, records with his band Gigantor, and is highly active online. John Henry Steve Jones had perhaps the most interesting post-career. While he continued on in the music business, Jones broke his leg due to an accident rock climbing in 1991, an injury which forced him into a desk job for a while. When he recovered, I kid you not, he moonlighted as a Renaissance fair jouster, from the outlaw John Henry Jones to the knight Sir Steve Jones. Also, according to him, Renaissance fair knights get way more chicks than rock stars. Who's to doubt a man who's been both? Due to his music experience at his desk job, though, Jones got a position writing jingles and themes for the entertainment industry, a job which he used to pivot into a TV producer role, a position which he retains today. What an odd career path. So the dream seemed dead and buried by 2012. It would have been too if it were not for the Inland Empire. Locals still had fond memories of that group that had come up out of their home. Nostalgics who included Alan Waddington and Paul Tollett. Tollett was a big-name fan of The Unforgiven, the president of concert promoters Golden Voice, making him one of the major figures behind Coachella. Due to Tollett's pull and Waddington's peacemaking, after years of relationship mending on and off, most of the band reunited in one form or another for one last show at the Stagecoach Country Music Festival in 2012. This 2012 lineup saw a composite band of Mike Jones, Mike Finn, and Alan Waddington sharing a stage with Steve Jones and Jay Lansford. along with former Poor Boys guitarist Dennis Hill joining the group for the occasion due to some members not being able to make it out. It was apparently a wide gap for Waddington to mend between Steve and the two Mikes, though. Emotions still ran high from the 80s. Jones admitted early practices for the reunion were tense in certain words, but conceded he was a tough bastard to be with in a band back in the day. The reunion sessions, beside featuring new material, also served as therapy, in the band's words, for old wounds that had festered for decades. It worked. On April 29th, 2012, the new, old, incarnation of the Unforgiven rolled out. Dressed in their iconic cowboy garb, though now a bit grayer, for one last show. They played a mixture of old and new material. All is quiet, Rover Pack, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Hang 'em High, reviving Days Like These, and closing with a rousing rendition of the anthem I Hear the Call, backed by the Inland Empire Drum Brigade. For the performance, the group even recorded one new track, The Long Run Out, subtitled The Ballad of the Unforgiven. For 25 years later, and maybe a few pounds heavier, the band still has it, and Jones' voice has aged like wine. This sort of far-flung finale reunion song proves that. It is a rousing ballad about a group of outlaws, obviously the Unforgiven, embracing their last stand against impossible odds. Proclaiming they'll let those backstabbing sons of bitches take this bunch down. Calling out the enemy, in that moment, the only thing that matters is that there is enough ammunition. And, as the legend grows of that band, it's up to you who you want to believe. The entire band was glad for one last redemption. Then, the Unforgiven could ride off into the sunset. Since then, there has not been much. The Unforgiven had one last blast, and everyone went back to their lives they had had for the past 20 years. Lives that were more real than their time in the Unforgiven, after all. Though, for the past few years, Jones has hinted there may be enough for a second album in them. The songs of the Unforgiven have always stuck with its members. While it may never come, they have earned their legacy. Not a music industry embarrassment, but a bunch of punk kids from California who made it farther than anyone believed they could. That legacy continues. I'm a second-generation Unforgiven fan after all, no matter how odd that may sound. As Jones spoke about their now-defunct website. But look, it's always a kick when people reach out to us, mostly through our website roverpack.com, which oddly gets a lot of hits, and share their stories of how our bands or certain songs impacted their lives. So do share that music if you like. The internet has given them a second frontier to ride across. I think the Unforgiven can make it a little further now. And maybe, this time, people will hear the call.
Are you ready to scream and shout? Kick up a ruckus, wake the dead, say yes I am! Are you ready to feel the power and the glory of the electric guitar? Say yes I am! If you're ready to rock, say yes I am! Say yes I am! Say yes I am! Good, 'cause we're the Unforgiven, and I'll clap.
My heaven in my hand, you see before you a man who's known greatness. I had a vision, a revelation. I took a look inside of me, and I am a sensation. Days like these, I feel like I can change the world.
After that long run out, I'd like to thank my patrons, the Single Way Out, and the Gelsomini family.